Hey y'all. When Marvel decided to revisit the Clone Saga in the 90s, they apparently forgot a lot of the significant aspects of both the original story and its aftermath, which is
Weird.
considering there were pretty regular callbacks and references to the original over the years. They obviously realized their mistakes later, which caused a lot of frantic backpedaling and retconning. We'll get to all that later. This, ladies and gentlemen, is my final video covering the original Clone Saga. I want to go over all those callbacks I mentioned just a moment ago, which means I have a shitload of material to cover this time, but let's finish the actual story first. So, without further ado...
The most scintillating man on the internet.
Amazing Spider-Man 149. The story so far has been going at a pretty reasonable pace, but I don't know if maybe Conway just forgot how many, or rather how few, issues he had remaining because he suddenly floors the gas in the finale. We get the resolution to last issue's cliffhanger, then we get the Jackal's origin story, then we get a bridging scene, a setup for the final battle itself, and then an epilogue. So maybe cramming all that shit into a single regular-sized issue is why some elements don't make any sense, but anyway. After Professor Warren's face reveal from last issue... Oh, by the way, keep an eye on Ned, because nobody else in the story is going to do that, well, apart from the Jackal, I guess. Pete falls unconscious, flashes back over recent events, and wakes up strapped to a table in an abandoned tenement. And that's Ned, right? I'm not crazy, that is Ned. Pete, of course, easily breaks out of his bonds and should effortlessly beat the Jackal down, but Jackal does the ass-kicking instead. Why? I don't know. I thought the Jackal was supposed to be a psychological threat to Pete and not a physical one, so this kind of comes out of nowhere, especially because it isn't even going to come up again. I guess it's just there to set up the rest of the issue. Anyway, once Pete's slumped on the floor, the Jackal explains his origin and why he's got such a rage boner for Spider-Man. Basically, Warren became fixated on Gwen, even though he tries to pass his feelings off as fatherly.
Right.
And consequently has a breakdown when he sees the news of her death, believing the press's portrayal of the tragedy being Spider-Man's fault, and comes up with a revenge plot that could charitably be called batshit. He gives 2 cell samples from an aforementioned class project to his aforementioned lab assistant, Anthony Serva, and encourages him to incubate them. A month later, a horrified Serva, realizing the growing clones are human, demands they be destroyed. Warren's well-reasoned response is to fucking murder poor Serva, and then try to distance himself from his horrific action by creating an alternate identity. He creates a furry suit with razor-sharp claws to complete this identity, finishes incubating the Gwen clone, and uses hypnosis to draw out the clone's memories buried within the RNA of the real Gwen's cells, and also to condition her to his will. Yeah, he's a sick bastard. Jackal challenges Pete to finish their fight tonight at Shea Stadium and escapes. Pete presumably leaves and takes Ned with him, right? Okay, so I don't know what the hell is going on in this next scene. Betty's friends are trying to comfort her over the Daily Bugle since she's understandably distraught over Ned's disappearance. Pete suddenly comes in and acts like a bumbling sitcom goofball for some reason, insisting he hasn't seen Ned in a week. This is one time where Jonah screams at Pete that I'm actually on Jonah's side. Pete says he'll look for him and leaves. Okay, so let me try to wrap my head around this. So maybe Pete was just acting this way to protect his secret identity, but if that's the case, why the hell didn't he rescue Ned beforehand? Maybe this is actually the first appearance of the clone? I mean, his behavior would make more sense in that case since he would be missing some memory, although we'll get back to the memory thing in a minute. But anyway, if this is the clone, why would the Jackal have him out in the first place? What's the advantage? Is this part of his plan? So cut to Spider-Man swinging towards Shea Stadium. So is this the real deal, or is this the clone? I don't know. Maybe I'm getting too far into the weeds here. But Pete is thinking about what just happened at the Bugle, so I guess this is the same character as in the previous scene. This is the real Spider-Man. We're back to wondering why he didn't rescue Ned earlier, but anyway. Also, he thought he'd find MJ alone at the Bugle. May I ask why he would think that? Anyway, it's implied Pete has realized how important MJ is to him, which is a bit of foreshadowing for next issue, as well as, I guess, confirmation that this is the real Peter Parker. On arriving, Pete is sideswiped yet again by the Jackal. I swear I think Pete spent more time unconscious than conscious this whole story. Then Jackal jabs him with a hypodermic needle for good measure. He wakes up later to be confronted by a clone of... yes, himself. Oh, yeah, the Jackal also cloned Spider-Man, by the way, spoilers. So Jackal, with the Gwen clone beside him, tells both Spider-Mans that one of them has some memories removed via that injection from earlier, somehow editing his RNA. So at the time of this issue's publication, it was widely believed that memory is contained within RNA, although the actual science on the subject has advanced quite a bit in the decades since. Point is that both Spider-Mans believe himself to be the original. Okay, so, first off, only one of them was given an injection, presumably, so there's that mystery solved already. Besides, far be it from me to remind Jerry Conway of his own story, but the Jackal's apparently been working on this plan for 2 years, meaning that's how long it's been since the cell samples were taken? Are you seriously suggesting that the real Peters now had the last 2 years of his memories removed? And how does the clone know about all the recent events with Jackal, the Gwen clone, etc.? Well, we're not going to get any answers to any of those questions, so let's move on. Oh, hey Ned. He's now strapped to a magic gene-detecting bomb that'll explode when either the timer runs out or the clone messes with it. Nice work, Peter. Seems like there should be a third option, like, I don't know, snagging Ned with a web line and pulling him away without even touching the bomb, but no, fuck Ned, I guess, because they immediately start fighting. Meanwhile, the Jackal cackles with insane glee while watching the fight. It's all enough to make the Gwen clone fight her way out of her post-hypnotic trance at last, whereupon she rips off his mask and tells him what an evil piece of shit he is. This in turn makes Warren snap back to, well, as much sanity as he ever had at least, and decide to pull Ned away from the bomb himself before it explodes. What an idea, right? Well, he succeeds, but the timer runs out before Jackal himself can get away, and, well... So he's dead, apparently. And one of the Spider-Mens is buried under the debris from the explosion, so he's dead too, apparently. Pete and the Gwen clone visit the real Gwen's gravesite. The Gwen clone is determined to start a new life for herself with her own identity. Can't wait to see how that pans out. They bid each other a tearful goodbye, and Pete returns home to MJ, where it's heavily implied they consummate their relationship at last. And that's it, the end of the original Clone Saga. Well, except for one little concern. Amazing Spider-Man 150. After the events of last issue, Pete's left to struggle with a dilemma we've all had to face at some point. Is he a clone or is he the original? Unlike the rest of us, however, Pete has a professional to turn to for assistance in the form of Dr. Kurt Connors, aka the Lizard, who gladly agrees to help. After running a battery of tests on Spider-Man, Connors advises him to rest up while waiting on the results, but Pete is awakened from his nap by the sudden arrival of a battery of his classic foes, this being a significant issue number after all, who all inexplicably disintegrate upon defeat. Well, that's because they're all constructs created by Alistair Smythe, who's inside a new and improved Spider Slayer robot, and who's been tracking Spider-Man since the beginning of the issue. Spider-Man, who's out of both energy and web fluid, on top of having an existential crisis, is about to be killed by Smythe. His life begins flashing before his eyes as a result, and his mind floods with some lovely Gil Kane-rendered images of MJ. He decides that since the clone would have been emotionally torn between Gwen and MJ, and he's already decided that his future lies with MJ, he must be the real deal and not the clone.
Okay.
This self-revelation gives him enough of a renewed surge of energy to take down Smythe. Afterwards, he returns to Connors' lab, where he finds Connors taking a nap.
Oh, how convenient!
He decides to just steal the test results and destroy them, convinced he doesn't even need to see them, knowing he's the real Peter Parker. I'm sure that won't come back to bite him in the ass later. So, did Doc Connors happen to look at the test results before he conked out? And all the subsequent times that Peter talked to Doc Connors, did the subject of the test results just never come up? Was Doc Connors at all annoyed at Spider-Man destroying the results of the test he'd worked so hard on? I know it was the 70s, but weren't those tests run with computers? Wouldn't the data be saved on those computers? Anyway, that's the actual end of the original Clone Saga. And now... In the first few pages of ASM 151, let's just take a moment to bask in the awesomeness of that cover, shall we? Pete decides to dispose of the body of the clone in a smokestack, since naturally it'll bring up too many awkward questions later. While doing so, his spider sense goes off, but Pete doesn't see anyone nearby, so he decides to ignore it. Always a smart decision. So the clone was already dead, but then was dropped into a smokestack for good measure. Looks pretty damn definitive, right? Next, in ASM 168 and 169, Pete catches wind of an envelope of incriminating photos Jameson apparently has on Spider-Man and manages to snag and reproduce them before returning the originals to Jameson's desk. And on these photos he finds... Okay, I love this setup on the cover of ASM 169, and at first you're like, oh shit. But on closer inspection it's like, wait, what? How the hell could Jameson have drawn this conclusion from these specific photos? Well, here's the answer. And, by the way, this has fuck all to do with anything, but I love how these crooks helpfully explain how they got here. Anyway, Jameson thinks that Spider-Man murdered Peter Parker and is impersonating him with a rubber mask. Peter apparently expected this reaction somehow and has prepared some faked photos in order to pretend the originals themselves are faked. When Jameson challenges him based on the fact that he's the only one who had access to the originals, Pete exploits Harry Osborn's publicly known insanity to claim he must have been the one to create the forgeries. Jameson just accepts this explanation and takes off,
Okay.
leaving Pete to laugh with relief that all this clone bullshit is finally over with. Spectacular Spider-Man number 25 through 31. Okay, I'll cover these issues in broad strokes, since there's a lot of stuff in here that's not related to the Clone Saga. Also, it's a great read, but then I'm very partial to Bill Mantlo, so I encourage you to read these issues yourself. It's also got Frank Miller's very first Daredevil art, and his work brings tears to my jaded eyes. Not to take anything away from regular artist Jim Mooney, because he turns in some great stuff too. Anyway, this shambling, corpse-looking character named Carrion starts making trouble in Pete's life, trashing his apartment and leaving a cryptic message scrawled on the wall. He eventually demonstrates a variety of powers, including the ability to make organic matter decay or burn with his mere touch, yeah, even apparently through his costume, super strength, I guess, since he's able to lift someone by the neck with one hand, levitation,
Okay.
teleportation, telepathy, superhuman pettiness, plus he carries this red dust he likes to throw in people's faces that has excuse me, an inconsistent variety of effects, from instant death to unconsciousness to acid-like corrosion. Carrion's not only aware of Spider-Man's secret identity, but he starts accusing Pete of murder on top of that. The victims in question? Gwen Stacy and Miles Warren. If all of this is sounding familiar, well, that's because Carrion is a clone of Miles Warren himself.
What a twist!
Apparently, just before the final battle at Shea Stadium, Warren dropped a cell sample from himself in an incubation pod. There was some kind of bug with the incubation process, leading to the clone's eventual death from accelerated aging. The fluid in the incubation pod kept the dead clone alive, however, and gave him all the unnatural powers he currently has. Now, much as I enjoy the story, I'll admit the finale is a little goofy. Carrion injects a sample of Pete's DNA into a primordial hentai monster with a compulsion to kill its nearest genetic neighbor, or something. Pete manages to escape from its tentacled grip, and then the thing ends up killing its creator, Carrion. Two little things I'd like to point out before we move on. Number one, this is one of the most creative sound effects I've ever seen, at least before reading Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. And number two, check out this coloring mistake. What If, number 30. In case you're not familiar, the premise of the What If series is to present an alternate version of significant events in Marvel history. Well, most of the time anyway. Sometimes they just do shit that's just... Anyway, this particular issue imagines what would have happened if the clones survived. What if, right? I can't say I'm familiar with Bill Flanagan, but I am somewhat familiar with Rich Buckler, and he does turn in some good work here. I mean, damn, check out this opening splash page. So what's odd about the entire setup of this issue is that from the clone's physical appearance to his immaturity and impulsivity, he seems to be based on high school Peter Parker. Though the dialogue does make it clear that the clone at least has Peter's memories of his freshman year of college, so apparently Flanagan just wanted to accentuate the gap in physical appearance and experience just for the sake of his story. Speaking of impulsivity, in this version of events, the clone sucker punches Pete and goes to rescue Ned. Warren still gets caught in the blast, and the clone, not considering for even a moment that he might not be the original, puts Pete in the clone casket and takes off to pick up his life again. We then get a bunch of hilariously dumb sequences where the clone sees that nothing in his life is the same, yet still doesn't arrive at the obvious conclusion. And the supporting cast isn't much better. Even though the clone looks very noticeably different, their reaction is mostly along the lines of, "Hey, nice haircut, Pete." The clone decides to do some investigating to find out why he can't remember anything of his recent life. Really, dude? Eventually finding out about Gwen's tragic death. Wait, my memory is perfect up until 3 years ago, so it's 3 years now? I thought it was 2? So I'm assuming once again Flanagan is just lengthening the time skip to try to make the story a little bit more plausible. Anyway, Pete too breaks into Warren's home and ransacks the place, looking for clues, and finally finds enough information for the fucking penny to drop at last. Pete too grabs Warren's notes and evades the cops investigating the break-in, then discovers he's being tracked by Kingpin, an enemy he of course has no memory of. So Pete too does the honorable thing and goes to free the original from the stasis pod, right? Nope, he just decides he'll claim Pete's life for himself. Wow, that almost reminds me of something. However, a disastrous run-in with the Kingpin in person, plus the realization that the real Pete really seems to have pulled his life together, forces Pete 2 to reassess and do the right thing. Pete and Pete 2 quickly devise a plan to take down the Kingpin as both Peter and Spider-Man, and this, the climax of the story, is actually worth the price of admission. The action's well executed, and the banter between the two Spider-Mans, as well as the banter between them and Kingpin and his goons, is a lot of fun to read. Then we have an epilogue that's just... I mean, I know it's just supposed to be funny and not meant to be taken seriously like most of the story, but anyway, we have both Pete's agreeing on an inane arrangement where they can both coexist, not completely out of character in the slightest. The end. Well, it's the end of the Spider-Man story. The issue also has an Inhuman story, and I do like Peter Gillis's writing, but firstly, it's nothing to do with Spider-Man, and secondly, even the greatest comic writer couldn't make me want to read an Inhuman story. Moving on. Spectacular Spider-Man Annual number 8. When you think of Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery, you probably think of the Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, the Lizard, the Vulture, Kraven the Hunter, Venom, Mysterio, Sandman, the High Evolutionary. Wait, you don't think of the High Evolutionary? Good, because otherwise I'd have to ask you what the fuck you're smoking and if you'd mind sharing some. Nevertheless, that's what we're dealing with in this issue. Now, to be fair, this is part of a crossover event involving the character, but Conway saw this as an opportunity to make some, tweaks to the Clone Saga. Why the hell this story even exists is something I'll talk about after the summary, so let's get into it. It's written by Conway again, as I said a second ago, with the art duties performed by Mark Bagley. It's good stuff, but this is obviously very early in Bagley's career because it's pretty light on style. I wouldn't have even recognized it as Bagley without seeing the credit on the first page. Anyway, the High Evolutionary is doing something that I can't seem to muster the attention span to understand, and apparently the Celestials are involved. What powers these Celestials possess, what purposes they pursue, no human mind can easily imagine, or easily give a shit about. Can you tell I'm not a big fan of Marvel's cosmic stuff? Anyway, recent events in this crossover involved men and women chosen for transformation by the gods of several mythological pantheons. See our fact pages for more details. Oh, I'll get right on that. For our purposes, the only relevant thing in the issue is that the High Evolutionary nabs the Gwen clone, analyzes her genetic makeup, and then delivers one hell of an info dump in the final pages. The High Evolutionary was wondering how a mere university biology prof was able to perfect cloning to such an incredible degree. Well, apparently he didn't. He instead developed some kind of genetic virus that transformed some random woman of a similar age and phenotype to Gwen into a nearly identical genetic duplicate. somehow giving her Gwen's memories at the same time. Now, how this explains the other clones like Peter and Carrion isn't explained, and by now you're probably thinking, isn't this going to cause some logistical issues when they decide to bring the Spider-Man clone back? Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because so far it's been nothing more than words from the High Evolutionary, and he just could be lying for whatever reason, right? Well, no, because one of the new characters created just for this crossover, apparently her name is Daydreamer, who gives a shit, transforms the Gwen clone back to her real self. Pretty cut and dried proof of the High Evolutionary's claims, one would think. So, why on earth did Conway write this issue that, over the course of one page, single-handedly torched his entire original story? According to this page I read on tvtropes.org, scientists during the 80s and 90s were beginning to think that actual cloning would simply never be possible. So apparently this was Conway's way of making his original story more realistic, even though, as the article quite rightly points out, the cloning science in the original story didn't bear any resemblance to any real science of cloning in the first place, so it seems to be a case of misplaced priorities. Anyway, only one more comic to cover, and unfortunately it's a follow-up to this one.
No! God, please, no!
Spectacular Spider-Man number 149. Written by Jerry Conway, once again, of course, who seemed to realize what a clusterfuck he'd created with the Spectacular Spider-Man annual, so he tries to, clarify things with this issue. Now, we do get some gorgeous art from Sal Buscema, who was in the middle of an outstanding run on this book. We also get the return of Carrion, kind of. It's actually a different Carrion, since Conway at least had the decency to leave the original dead, that is, rather than just undead. Anyway, after the revelations of the annual, Pete's obsessed with finding out who Carrion could have been, since the whole cloning thing never actually happened. Now maybe I'm just self-centered, but if I were in Pete's position, I think I'd be more concerned with finding out who my own clone was, rather than Carrion, but Pete never seems to consider that. Pete decides to check out Warren's journals, which he easily finds within seconds in the remains of his lab. Note that the narration tells us the lab's been sealed for ages, but Pete's able to just walk in there unhindered. The journals all confirm everything the High Evolutionary told him, and even gives us the name of the woman who'd been turned into the Gwen duplicate, Joyce Delaney. And Pete's duplicate? None other than Anthony Serba. Pete's being tailed by a fellow grad student named Malcolm McBride, who's trailing Pete like a bad smell after being beaten to a research grant by him. Seconds after Pete leaves, McBride stumbles on a test tube containing a strange liquid. Funny how Pete didn't stumble on that, but anyway, you can guess what happens next.
You are stupid.
Later, since Pete didn't find any answers about who Carrion was in Warren's journals, he heads out again in costume this time for some reason. Well, I guess it's a good thing he did, because he happens to be confronted by the new Carrion. Back up for a second, though. Warren must have felt remorse for what he'd done to Serba and Joyce Delaney, and when he realized Serba might die during our battle, and an explosion meant for me, that remorse forced him to rescue us at the cost of his own life.
Okay?
Yeah, okay, sure. You know, here's the problem, or one of many problems. When you start introducing retcons, especially when it's a retcon of your own story, you make things so convoluted and needlessly complicated that they become nonsensical. Pete and the shiny new Carrion fight, Carrion burning with revenge for Gwen's death to fulfill the wishes of his creator. Since the new Carrion is only hours old, he doesn't know anything about Warren's death. And Pete trying to explain about the replicator virus bullshit. Carrion eventually moves the fight to the graveyard where Gwen and her father are buried, and good thing Warren happens to be buried there too, since seeing the gravestone shocks Carrion enough for Peter to quickly take him down. So Pete makes a mental note to ask Reed Richards about an antidote to the replicator virus. Guess he never followed up on that. He's convinced himself to move on from Gwen and let go of the past, which he'd supposedly already done at the end of the original Clone Saga, but whatever. So we find out who Pete's clone was, a question that was never actually asked, but we never do find out who the original Carrion was, a question that actually was asked. Anyway, that's it. That's all there is. Look, I know I've taken a couple of potshots at Conway's writing over the course of these videos. I do want to make it clear that I don't dislike Conway's writing. In fact, I've liked a lot of his ideas, and I certainly respect his place in comics history. I just think that, speaking of ideas, he tends to be better with those than he is with execution. Plus, I don't really like it when artists, especially writers, get their panties in a wad when some readers dare to criticize them, and their response is to write some story that's meant as petty revenge against those meanie audience members. Not saying that was entirely Conway's motivation for the Clone Saga, but you can hardly blame me for immediately thinking about that. I mean, we're talking about the same dude who was horrified that a lot of people like the Punisher. But the Clone Saga itself is one thing. The ridiculous clone virus retcon in the Spectacular Spider-Man annual was something else entirely. I also didn't care for the Gwen clone being relegated to a plot device. Conway's point was moronically clear. Get over Gwen's death and move on with your lives, nerds. Funny how the original story was supposed to have made that point already. Then the clone comes back in the annual, and we have Pete in a moral quandary again, causing MJ a ton of grief. But it all once again seems to be resolved at the end, but 5 minutes later, we get the clone origins nonsense in SSM 149, with MJ once again having to listen to Pete's self-absorbed drivel. Another source I came across while I was wrapping up this video has this to say: his cloning virus retcon should have tied up all the loose ends. Oh, okay. So I guess the purpose of the retcon was to prevent later writers from returning to it? Well, that worked out well. First the writers forgot about or ignored the retcon, then they retconned the retcon, but that's all for another time. In the next part, we'll pick up with the 90s Clone Saga at last, specifically with the first 4-part story, Power and Responsibility. As always, thank you for watching. Stay well, and I'll see you next time. Oh, one more thing. Yes, it's taken me an entire year to put this thing together. That's on top of using about 10 different mics. There's really no excuse for that, so I just wanted to let everyone know that I'll be making a concerted effort to get on some kind of regular upload schedule in 2024. Time to go drink some water. Happy New Year, everyone.
Money can't buy happiness, then why is it so fabulous?
Pete and the Gwen clone visit the real Gwen's Gwape site.